All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This will be the final lecture in our week on multiculturalism. We are going to now talk about Toni Morrison's short story, Recitatif. So, Toni Morrison is probably the most celebrated, the most honored, the most famous, the most well known author of not so much the multicultural period of American literature, but really of this entire period of American literature, this entire late 20th, early 21st century period. I think Morrison is considered the major fiction writer of this era, alongside a handful of others like Thomas Pynchon or Philip Roth, among some of the ones we've read already. So she's represented in the anthology by her only short story, What is Recitatif, or her only published short story. I assume she has more in the archives, which is in certain ways not really characteristic of her work. So it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, it's a great story in what it's trying to do, and it's a virtuoso performance, a tour de force, as they say. But it's not totally indicative of her novels. So, who is Toni Morrison as a writer, and what is Recitatif all about? So Morrison lived from 1931 to 2019. She was born Chloe Ardelia Wofford, which she changed to Chloe Anthony Wofford upon her Catholic conversion, at which she performed the confirmation process, which is kind of the coming of age ceremony in the Catholic faith. So Anthony, so in confirmation, you take the name of a kind of patron saint. And so she took Saint Anthony, and that's where Toni comes from. And she was born in Lorain, Ohio, which is this industrial small city in that Rust Belt, upper Midwest area. And I think they mentioned in the Norton Anthology that one of the things that's distinctive about her work in comparison to a lot of prior African American authors was that their work had been set primarily either in the rural South or in the urban North, like New York or Chicago. And Morrison, in setting a lot of her work around this Rust Belt, upper Midwest, Ohio area, it was kind of expanding the setting range of African American fiction. So she goes to Howard University, a historically black university, for her bachelor's degree, and then to Cornell for her master's degree in English. And she writes her master's thesis on modernist novelists, Virginia Woolf, the English modernist novelist, and William Faulkner, the American modernist novelist. And a lot of her work is kind of is, at least on the surface, a kind of throwback to modernism. She uses a lot of modernist techniques in her fiction, such as stream of consciousness writing, which goes deeply into the inward thoughts of the characters. And that, that kind of went away a little bit with postmodernism, because postmodernism didn't really believe that human beings had this psychological depth in the same way that modernists did. So in certain ways there's a kind of old-fashioned quality to Morrison. But anyway, she is briefly married to an architect named Harold Morrison. So that's where, so Toni comes from Anthony, her confirmation name, and Morrison comes from the last name of her husband, who she just had a brief marriage to. We don't really know the details there. I think she said something like, like he wanted her to cook him dinner every night, and that wasn't what she was about. So that marriage didn't last. But she had two sons, and as a single mother, she worked as an editor at Random House from 1967 to 1983. So Random House is a major publishing company, and she focused particularly on publishing the work of black writers of all sorts. So this is part of that. If we've been talking in a very theoretical way and looking at writers like Reed and Unseldua about the importance of intervening at the level of culture to change things. And Morrison does that. They're doing it as writers, but Morrison as an editor was able to do it in a much more sort of materially tangible way by acquiring. So what an editor does is acquire books, that is, decide what books the company will publish, and then work with the author to get it into publishable shape. And I think back in the day, they also worked on sort of the publicity aspects of it as well. So she was involved in kind of changing American culture by broadening its representation of African Americans by publishing everything from like experimental fiction by writers like Gail Jones and Henry Dumas to celebrity autobiography, like the autobiography of Muhammad Ali, the boxer. So she works in publishing, and as she's working in publishing as a single mother, she's writing her first novels. And she talks about how she would wake up 2 hours before dawn to write, before the kids were awake and before she had to go to work. And then gradually her novels become more and more recognized, more and more celebrated. They go on the bestseller lists, with especially her third novel, Song of Solomon, in the late 1970s. And so she's eventually able to retire from publishing, and she does have a bit of a teaching career in colleges and universities, particularly Princeton, until she retires in 2006. But she becomes a full-time novelist, and her novels include Song of Solomon, as I mentioned, which is this coming-of-age story of an African American young man who has to go from the sort of Rust Belt north. It's set in a nameless city, kind of like Detroit, but to find his heritage down south. And then most famously Beloved, her 1987 novel about American slavery, told in the form of a ghost story with stream of consciousness narration. And that's her most famous story, her most celebrated novel. And then in 1993, she wins the Nobel Prize for her entire body of work. Now, the Nobel Prize is a global literary prize. It is more or less the highest prize you can receive in the literary world. And Morrison, I think, is the first American writer we've read this semester that won the Nobel Prize. Several of them were often candidates. John Ashbery's name often came up as a possible candidate for the Nobel Prize, but he died. Philip Roth wanted it very badly, famously wanted it very badly, and his work was just, I think, too controversial for them. But she receives the Nobel Prize in 1993, and then we're only going to see, I think, one more Nobel Prize winner, the most recent, later in the course, Louise Glick, the poet, who we'll read in a few weeks. She is the most recent winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. They don't give it to Americans a lot. It's a European committee, and they've voiced over the years some criticisms of American literature and American writers and American culture, but Morrison did win it in 1993. So, and again, Recitatif is not altogether typical of her work. It's much more conventionally narrated. It's just a fairly straightforward linear first person narrative. It doesn't have, so one of the things her work is famous for is what's called magical realism, which is a term I'm going to formally explain in detail in 2 weeks. We're going to have a whole section in 2 weeks on what happens to realism at the end of the 20th century, because it's not that people stop writing realism. As we've seen, we've just read realist stories all week with Silko and Tan and now Morrison, but I want to have a more formal discussion about what happens to realism. And one of the things that happens to it is this genre of magical realism. And I'm going to explain that with reference to the work of Louise Erdrich, a Native American writer of the same generation, roughly, as Leslie Marmon Silko, in a couple weeks. But so Morrison generally wrote her novels in this magical realist style, but Recitatif is, on the surface, a much more conventional short story. It doesn't look that different from something like Amy Tan's popular realism until you realize what's going on in the story. And so we'll talk about what's going on in a minute. So this story is from 1983. What does the word recitative, it's sort of a strange title, mean? It's the French version of the English word recitative, which is, as they explain in the Norton Anthology, a vocal performance in which a narrative is not stated but sung. And that's actually not that great of an explanation. I say, well, what, like a vocal performance in which you sing? That's just a song. So that's the better explanation is, sorry, I'm just having a little bit of fun at the expense of the editors of the very expensive and prestigious Norton Anthology. But what it is a partially spoken interlude in an opera. So there'll be an opera, and then there'll be a moment where a character will sing, or sort of half sing and half speak to the audience. The point is, it's kind of similar to a word we learned when we were looking at drama, which was monologue. It's sort of like a monologue. And so this story is the monologue of the narrator, Twyla. And it's what is the opera in which it is the interlude? I think it's the opera of American race, the opera of the relationship between black and white people, and particularly black and white women in America, and the relationship between the upper and the lower class in America. Because this is a story about race, class, and gender, and how they all work together. And the thing about the story that makes it so not what it appears to be on the surface, a very conventional work of realism, is what it does. And what it does, if you read it, you know, is it's a story about the relationships between two characters, the narrator and her Twyla and her friend Roberta, and one of them is black and one of them is white, but you don't know which is which. And you do know other things. They're both women. They both spent time in this sort of quasi-orphanage. That's where they met as a child. They both live in, looks like, upstate New York. We know that one is rich and one is not poor, but of a lower class, and we're told which one there. Twyla is of the lower class, Roberta is of the upper class. So we're given a lot of information about their race, their class, their gender, not their race, I mean their class, their gender, where they're from, their backgrounds, their religion. So Roberta's mother is very religious, Twyla seems to be more or less without religion. We're even told their political views. In vis-a-vis racial segregation, we're told their political views, but none of that tells us which one is black and which one is white. And this is part of Morrison's investigation then. What is race? What is race if you can know all these things about a person? Gender, class, religion, political ideology, region, and not know their race. What does that mean? What does that mean that race is in America? And that's what this story is about. And so I do want to look at it. My approach is going to be a little bit different, though. Normally I look very closely at certain passages with you, but this story I think requires that we pull back and look at it as a whole. Because the interesting thing about this story is that you basically have to read it twice. You have to read it once thinking that Twyla is black and Roberta is white, and if that's true, their interactions mean one thing. And then you have to read it again as if, I forgot what I said the first time, and then you have to read it again vice versa. And if you decide their races are the opposite, it means another thing. Now, I've taught this story a couple times, so let me say one thing at the outset. Some students think that there is some way to determine who is black and who is white. There isn't. That's the point. There's no information in the story that will tell you that. What happens in the story is that every time you as a reader, whatever your own race is, whenever you think you found something that tells you who's black and who's white, Morrison is essentially asking you, why do you think that? What does race mean to you that leads you to think that this particular thing means somebody is black, or this means somebody is white? Do you have to be black to like a black musician? Are all white people rich and all black people poor? Is that what you think? Because that's literally not true. And so she's prodding the reader. Why do you think this? Why do you associate certain traits of a person with something you call race, which we might better call racial ideology? Why is that? So it's a story that's an investigation of racial ideology. So I'm going to look at, the story is structured according to 5 encounters these two women have over the whole course of their lives, from their childhood to their, looks like their middle age. And so I'm going to look at each encounter and look at what it might mean if we read Twyla as black or white and Roberta as black or white. So that's going to be my approach. And then I do want to end by looking at the last line of the story, because the last line of the story asks us a question, and I want us to think about that question. Before we get into it, I sometimes introduce quotations from authors to frame their work, and I thought, what better way to introduce this story than to introduce it with a quotation that's semi-unfortunately the most famous thing Toni Morrison has ever said. Toni Morrison said something once, or wrote something, that became just a very well-known quotation. People who have no idea about literature and would never pick up a book by her know she said this, and still sometimes say it or riff on it or play with it. And it's a very ill-understood point that she was making. So the thing she said in 1998, or the thing she wrote, was, this is how it's remembered: Bill Clinton is the first black president. And so what did she mean by that? Bill Clinton, the former president of the United States, the 42nd president of the United States, who was president for most of the 90s, was obviously a white man. So what did she mean when she said he was the first black president? So what she meant, she writes it in an essay that she publishes in 1998 at the time of the impeachment. So Bill Clinton, the president, was being impeached for, it's a long story, for lying. He was accused of lying and encouraging others to lie in a lawsuit related to sexual harassment having to do with his affair with the intern Monica Lewinsky. So that's the background. And so he was impeached by the Republican-dominated House majority. And Morrison, in common with many other people who were, and Morrison, I think, is probably politically well to the left of Bill Clinton, but did not appreciate this, and thought that this essentially was I think the word she used was a coup, kind of conservative coup against this liberal president. And so she writes an article objecting to the impeachment. And what she says is this. The thing she says, and this is the quotation, she says, years ago, in the middle of the Whitewater investigation, this was another investigation the Republicans were conducting into Clinton's financial dealings, one heard the first murmurs. And if you read it, what she says leading up to this, the murmurs are coming from black men. She says, one heard the first murmurs, white skin notwithstanding, this is our first black president. So it doesn't matter that what his color of his skin is, he's black. And she attributes this not to her own view, but to what she's hearing, particularly from men in the black community. Blacker than any actual black person who could ever be elected in our children's lifetime. After all, Clinton displays almost every trope of blackness. So a trope is a kind of metaphor, a metonymy, some kind of figuration, something that he displays a bunch of things that stand somehow for blackness. Single-parent household, born poor, working class, saxophone playing, McDonald's and junk food loving boy from Arkansas. And when virtually all the African American Clinton appointees began one by one to disappear, when the president's body, his privacy, his unpoliced sexuality became the focus of the persecution, when he was metaphorically seized and body searched, who could gainsay, that is, doubt, these black men who knew whereof they spoke? So here's her point. Her point is that blackness in America is a set of meanings imposed on a certain group of people, and they get their source from the other thing that's imposed on these people, which is their poverty and their often imposed criminal status. So tropes of blackness are tropes of poverty, and they're tropes of, let us put it this way, being policed. And that is the sense in which Bill Clinton was black. He was being treated like he was black by a group of people that Morrison, I think, thought hated both black people and poor people. And so that's why Clinton, in her view, was black. Because tropes of blackness are tropes of poverty and tropes of oppression. So that's what racialization is. It's the imposition of an ideology on a group of people that usually does the work of oppressing them. Now, in other things Morrison writes, she defines blackness as a genuine form of culture in some of the same ways that Ishmael Reed does, that there is a black culture in the United States. But for her, and I actually think Reed would probably agree with this, the culture is formed despite this imposition of ideology and in resistance to it. It doesn't come, there's no essentialism here. Remember we talked about the critique of essentialism, that any human being has an essential gender identity, for instance. Well, Morrison says there's not an essential racial identity either. You're black if you're treated as black, in her view. And so once we understand that she thinks that, particularly in this case, race is a kind of proxy for class. Race is a way of talking about class. Or as she says in some of her other work, race is a way of diffusing the class struggle in America by setting up a hierarchy that's not based on class. So that even the poorest white people in a white supremacist society can feel superior to black people, all black people, even rich black people. And so we don't have a class struggle in America the way you might have it in certain European countries. It's all placed onto or displaced onto a racial struggle. And so that's the function of race, is to mystify to confuse, to lie about the structure of our society by imposing this ideology on people who are not essentially any one thing. And that's what this story, I think, is about how racial ideology functions. But instead of just being about that in kind of a distanced way, the story performs the act of investigating racial ideology by constantly making the reader question our racial ideology. As I was saying, why do we think that X means Twyla is black and Roberta is white, or vice versa? All right, so let's get into the story then. I want to look at their 5 encounters, particularly the first 4, with the idea in mind of what does this suggest if Twyla is black and Roberta is white, and what does it suggest if Twyla is white and Roberta is black? Because you have to read it both ways. You really do. I mean, I hope you read the story once, but you really do have to read the story twice. I think it only works if you read it twice. So their first encounter, they meet at St. Bonnie's, this orphanage, and they have, when they're 8 years old, and they spend 4 months as friends, and they have a lot of differences from each other. The story begins by talking about Twyla says, "My mother danced all night and Roberta's was sick." And we don't know what sick means, if it's physical, mental, what it means. Danced all night seems to be a kind of euphemism for saying that she was maybe involved with, I don't know, with sex and drugs and in some way that made her unable to care for her child. So they have these differences, and Twyla, accordingly, again, one thing we know is that Twyla is the poorer of the two. That Twyla does not come from money, and Roberta does. And Roberta's mother is very proper and very religious. And when the two mothers meet, Roberta's mother scorns Twyla's mother, and Twyla's mother is furious. And there's that very funny scene where she's sitting in the church and she says, "That bitch in church." So Morrison is a very funny writer. I don't think she often gets credit often enough for that. So we know that, and we are told Twyla says that one is black and one is white. And she says that, we have she says, "My mother taught me certain things about them." And they're sort of very crude, racist stereotypes about, they smell. But we don't know if that's coming from, because anybody could be prejudiced. Any two groups could be prejudiced against one another. So we don't know if it's a prejudice that's coming from a white perspective or a black perspective. We just know that it's held. So, and I think Morrison is interested in something bigger than just prejudice, because any two groups could have prejudice against each other, but racial ideology is the kind of structure, a kind of economic structure even of American society, is I think what she's interested in. So let's take this first encounter between the two. What does it mean if we read it with Twyla being black and Roberta being white? I think in this case, Morrison is exploring the possibilities of friendship across both race and class lines, where a poor African-American girl, Twyla, befriends a richer white girl. So they're heavily divided by these two barriers of race and class. Now, if we read it the other way, with Twyla being white and Roberta being black, then Morrison is subverting stereotypes about race and class. Because, as I was saying, I think Morrison often focuses in her work on the way that race is a way of talking or not talking about class. And so I think the way that that plays out in certain stereotypes that people throughout society hold is that white people are generally richer than black people. And there is a dichotomy of particularly inherited wealth between the two communities, which stems from the history of slavery and segregation. But it doesn't play out in every case. There has been since, for a very long time, depending on the region of the country, an African-American elite, a black bourgeoisie that has existed for like I said, in some places like New Orleans for centuries. And then, of course, there's plenty of poor white people, lots of poor white people. So this could be a story about a poor white girl befriending a wealthy African-American girl. And in that case, if you just think Twyla is black because she's poor and Roberta is white because she's rich, well, your racial ideology in this case might be confusing your ability to think clearly about the realities of class and economics in America. So that, I think, is how the first encounter plays out. Let's look at the second one. So this is a couple years later, when they appear to be teenagers in the late 60s, during the time of the 60s counterculture. Twyla is still a working class person. She's working at a hotel near the freeway in New York when Roberta and two male friends come in, and they're on their way to see Jimi Hendrix. And the key moment here is that Roberta slights Twyla. Her and her friends make fun of her because she's not very sophisticated. She doesn't know who Jimi Hendrix is, and they just kind of look down on her and don't think much of her. And Roberta doesn't reciprocate her friendship. So in this scene, if Twyla is black and Roberta is white, then Morrison is displaying different cultural and lifestyle options generally available to people of different races, because Twyla has to work for a living, while Roberta seems to be much more economically independent, can go join the counterculture. Might be a similar point that Joan Didion makes about, rich white kids going to join the counterculture. And the irony here would be that Jimi Hendrix, an African-American musician, is kind of enjoyed by this white counterculture, while black working class people don't necessarily have access to this sort of subculture because they're too immersed in just the struggle to survive. So I think that's what it means if Twyla is black and Roberta is white. If Twyla is white and Roberta is black, then Morrison is again combating a stereotype, particularly in this case, that the counterculture was wholly white, which it wasn't, as Jimi Hendrix's existence proves. So many African Americans participated in the 60s counterculture, and there's no reason that Roberta couldn't be among them. And then conversely, working class white people didn't necessarily have the freedom to do that, because they were, again, as I just said, immersed in this struggle just to get by from day to day. So you can't make this simplistic judgment about culture and its relation to wealth and its relation to race. I think, again, in either case, Morrison's point is that class makes a big difference. class almost makes the primary difference, but in this particular instance, more so than race. It's class that's the defining variable here, more than race is. All right, what about the third encounter? So this is 12 years later. This is when they're sort of fully adults, like around 30, and they meet in a new grocery store. So Twyla talks about how she gets married and she has kids, and she's talking about her in-laws and how they've always lived in this sort of small city that was kind of a poor city in upstate New York, but then it got gentrified when they got a computer. IBM, the computer company, sort of moves in, and all sorts of white-collar people start working there. So the neighborhood gets gentrified, and they put in this new sort of Whole Foods type high-end grocery store. And this is where she meets Roberta. And so Twyla herself at this point has kind of become a little more solidly middle class, and has married a firefighter and has a child, while Roberta has married a rich executive and become a stepmother to his 4 children. So Twyla has advanced a little bit in class, and Roberta has advanced a little bit in class, but the divide still remains. Roberta's still wealthier. And I think Morrison's point is that the class you're born into does, to a certain extent, not wholly. I mean, her own life proves this, because I think she was born into the working class and died fairly wealthy. But for the most part, the class you're born into does determine a lot of your chances in life. So in this encounter, what happens if Twyla is black and Roberta is white? Well, then Morrison is emphasizing through the portrayal of Twyla's in-laws. Here I'm assuming that they're black, but that's not an assumption one can safely make either. But if we go with it for a second, there's a long-standing African-American presence in places like upstate New York, which is itself defying a stereotype. And it's showing how lower middle class African Americans experience things like gentrification and being economically surpassed by whites with more opportunity. Now, if Twyla is white and Roberta is black, then Morrison is portraying the white lower middle class as also exposed to economic inequality in the form of gentrification, while she portrays middle class African Americans as able to join the economic elite. So essentially, it works the same way almost every time. I think her point here is really about the relationship between class and race. She's trying to disaggregate these two ideas in our mind. She's trying to remind people that class and race are not the same thing. And that's what she sees happening in the Bill Clinton affair, so to speak, which is that he was being racialized because of his class. She wants to de-racialize class and de-class race. Now, the fourth encounter is in many ways the most complex, because they encounter each other on two sides of the issue of busing to enforce racial integration. So this was something, I think, particularly in the 1970s, that was a big issue, where certain cities and counties and municipalities were trying to desegregate schools on the basis of race, and the method they were using was what was called busing. And so if this school and let's say this one neighborhood was white, and so all the kids in the school were white, and this other neighborhood was black, and all the kids in the school were black, the community would set up a program where some of the black kids would have to get on the bus and go across town to the white school, and some of the white kids would have to get on the bus and go across town to the black school, and thus you wouldn't have white and black schools. And there was a lot of protests against this. And this is the story, I think, where Morrison is most challenging. Because if Twyla is black and Roberta is white, then it kind of fits the general interpretation most people have of these events. Because Twyla supports busing and Roberta opposes it. So Twyla supports busing, presumably because she thinks it will be effective against racism, while Roberta believes integration will endanger her children's education, possibly because she is racist. So, and that's the way the protests against busing are usually remembered, as a white protest with this racist underpinning. But I think one of the things Morrison wants to remind us is that wasn't totally true and wasn't totally the way it worked out. And so, number one, if Twyla is white, then there were white parents who didn't mind this, who didn't think integration would harm their children. There are plenty of white parents who didn't protest this, number one. So Morrison wants to remind us of the good news that not all white people are racist. And then this is, I think, the most challenging point. There were protests in African American communities. There were people in African American communities who didn't like this idea either, because they thought it would disrupt their children's lives. They thought it would break up African American communities. They thought it might not be safe for their children who were black to go to schools that were majority white, especially where their parents are having picket lines against it. And so there were reasons that African American communities had to protest busing as well, which sort of got dropped from the narrative. And so Morrison is again trying to complicate our view of what race is and what we think race is. All right, and then their fifth encounter is they meet in a coffee shop on Christmas Eve and discuss their memories of, and this is something that's been, I haven't talked about yet, but it's going all through the story, this character of Maggie. So Maggie was a woman of ambiguous race. She was a disabled woman. She was deaf and she couldn't speak. And they seem to have joined other girls in bullying her at the orphanage. And it begins when Twyla tells us there was an apple orchard in which Maggie fell. And this memory is revisited again and again. Did she fall or was she pushed? And did Twyla and Roberta join the other girls whom they call gargoyles in a kind of childish mishearing of gargoyle? Did they join the other girls in pushing her? And did they kick her when she was down? And what does it mean? And this story is revisited again and again. They can't tell Maggie's race. They don't know. And this is part of Morrison's point. Race is not simply skin color. They said her skin was, I think the word they used was sandy. She could have been white or black. They don't really know. They know that she was disabled, but they didn't know the degree of her disability. Was she cognizant of what people were saying to her? And why do they revisit this? And literally the last line of the story, when Roberta is crying over this memory, she says, "What the hell happened to Maggie?" And so that, I think, is a question I want to end with. What does Maggie represent? And Toni Morrison loves symbolism. She's written essays about how she wrote her own fiction, in which she talks about deliberately introducing symbolism. And so we have a fall in an apple orchard at the beginning of the story. So clearly the fall of Maggie is really Roberta and Twyla losing their innocence, being expelled from the Eden of their friendship. So what does it mean? Well, they each agree that something about Maggie reminded them of their mother, the way their mothers couldn't change. You know, my mother's still sick, my mother never stopped dancing. And this fact that they couldn't, that Maggie's disabilities reminded them of the fact that their mothers had some inability to give them love. And this induced a rage in them that made them want to hurt her. And I think that Morrison, just as we saw Ansel Dua use the Jungian idea of shadow projection to explain things like racism and sexism and homophobia, I think Morrison's doing the same thing, particularly to look at the relations between women. And we talked about the divide in feminism between white and black women. And the reason, apparently, in Morrison's view, that there comes to be this conflict and this hatred between races and classes and between different groups of women is because of this wounded desire for love. This desire for love that you feel the other person can't reciprocate, and so you harm the other person before they can harm you first by rejecting you. And so that is the thing, this harming of Maggie, whatever her race. But in any case, they sort of it's as if they themselves need someone they think is lower than them to abuse to disguise their own vulnerability. And that's what any kind of social hatred is in this story. And that is the thing the story wants to overcome by making us confront our own racial ideology, because racial ideology is, in the United States, I think Morrison believes, the main ideology through which we harm each other, instead of talking about one, the economic level of how is our society divided in some ways even more fundamentally by class than race if we really look at it. So race is preventing us from talking about that. And psychologically, it becomes this way of our not dealing with our own inner lives, the vulnerability and the need that we feel for love that causes us to lash out at others when we don't think we can have that love. And so that's what I think Recitatif is ultimately about. And that will be the last lecture for this week. Thanks very much. Have a great day.